everybody, just imagine for a moment that for £2,000 you could say to anybody who asked you what car you drove, "Oh, I've got one of those things like what James Bond had." Not only that, it was also a good car. Can it be so? Well, it might with this, the Mk4 Ford Mondeo. Now, of course, you mention James Bond and cars to just about anybody, and they're almost certainly going to think of an Aston Martin. But over the decades, he has dabbled with a few other brands as well, including famously Lotus for a little bit in the late 70s and early 80s, then a little while later BMW. But for a brief moment in the rather brilliant 2006 film Casino Royale, he drove a Ford Mondeo. And if for a moment you've forgotten that he did, it's fairly early on in the film when he's driving to the hotel, I think in the Bahamas or somewhere, where he then eventually acquires his DB5. The DBS, the car that we all associate with Casino Royale, didn't actually appear until a fair bit later in the film. And then it didn't last very long either, meeting a rather bad end. Now, I think the chances of anybody buying one of these because it was in a James Bond film are fairly slim. And so today, I want to talk to you about the many other reasons why you might be interested in a Ford Mondeo. So then, what exactly is it that we have here today? Well, rather confusingly, this is a Mark IV car, which is the third generation. The Mark I and II were members of the first generation. The second gen only had the 1 Mark, the 3, and then this had the 4th. I really don't know how or why that works, and it gets even worse and more confusing when you start to look at Fiestas, because for those, they also don't even line up the marks depending on exactly where in the world that it is. And I think like a Mark 7 here is a Mark 6 elsewhere, or the other way around. It's all very, very confusing, and because I don't really speak Ford, I don't really understand it at all. And incidentally, only yesterday I recorded a video with a lovely Vauxhall Omega, and I said in that both Ford and Vauxhall really are family brands, much like Ford and General Motors elsewhere, Vauxhall of course being the British arm of GM. It's the sort of brand where your dad has one, your mum has one, your older brother has one, you're going to have it when he's done with it, and so help you God if you turn up with the other brand, be it either Ford or Vauxhall, delete as applicable. And though it would be very, very easy for me to say that the reason that everybody apparently in Britain in the 70s, 80s and 90s drove either a Ford or Vauxhall was because either the company they worked for had a deal with one of those firms, or the town they lived in had a dealership for one of those firms. That's not actually entirely true, because both of them, over a great many years, also produced some really genuinely very good cars. And I firmly believe this is one of those. Let's start with the looks. Though it's, I would say, fairly inoffensive, it's also not a bad looking car. When you consider it is getting on for near 20 years old as a design, it's actually still a fairly handsome and shapely thing. It adopted Ford's new kinetic design language of the time, taking over from the new edge styling of the 1990s, and it's still a pretty good looking thing, I would say. You could park it in just about any modern car park and it would be reasonably difficult to date. Inside, it is showing its age a little bit more, and I have to say I was quite shocked to see that it actually has a big digital display in the middle of the dash here. I don't think I've actually even sat in one of these cars before, so when I was greeted with that I thought, oh blimey, that's well, quite cute. It's very much of its time, but I suppose in 2008 would have felt quite advanced and very cool. It's nice, it does the job, gives you control of your radio, which here in this model is a Sony unit to the left, and various trip computer functionality, all sorts of very good stuff. Here in Britain, the Mondeo was effectively the range-topping car in the Ford lineup, being usefully bigger than the Focus below it, and that itself usefully larger than the Fiesta below it. And to be honest, there is a nice, clean clear separation between all of them. This car you could have either as a 5-door saloon, as you have it here, or also as an estate, which I think actually looks even better than the saloon. Ford being Ford, they didn't really do options per se, but instead they had trim levels, and this one is the Titanium X, which is more or less the top of the line one. I think they also did a Titanium X Sport, perhaps shortly after this car was made, but in either case, it's a very, very well specified car. You have dual zone climate control, which currently seems to be struggling a little bit. You have an electrically height adjustable driver's seat, though the other adjustments are manual. They're also actually quite nice, comfortable. They are part leather, part fabric. You've got all these controls on the steering wheel for all of your dash up here, as already mentioned. You've got electric windows all round, and of course other niceties that by this time would have been considered standard: ABS, power steering, etc, etc. There is no sunroof. That's a bit of a shame, but I don't think one would have even been an option. You also have keyless start, though not handily keyless entry, which today is very much a bonus. And to get the engine to fire into life, you press the Ford power button down here. That leads me neatly onto the other interesting thing about this car, which is the choice of engine. Now, for this generation of Mondeo, like its forebears, the vast majority of sales would have been for either a petrol or, more likely, diesel in a 4-cylinder configuration. However, at the top of the range, you would find this, the 2.5 litre turbo 5-cylinder petrol adopted from Volvo, which Ford at the time owned. It is effectively the same engine as in the Focus ST of the day. And I said earlier that Fords are often a family affair. Well, today we are proving that, because this is one of a pair that I am driving today, both of which are powered by the same 2.5 litre 5-cylinder turbo and are owned by father and son. Later on today, I shall be driving the son Ben's Focus ST of roughly the same age. Continuing the theme of Fords in the family, Paul has actually had one on the driveway for most of his working life, dating all the way back to the 1970s, with a bit of a blip in the 2000s and 2010s. But even his father was also a Ford man, having had a Cortina, then later a number of Escorts. Then Paul himself had Sierras as company cars back in the day. Later then, they turned into Mondeos, and it sounds like for some time he was the archetypal rep, doing tens of thousands of miles in his Fords, quite happily selling product the old-fashioned way. And it is Ben that I have to thank for organising today, because not only did he get his dad into buying this particular car, he also convinced him to bring it out for review. Though I am told it didn't take too much convincing, so a big thank you to Paul as well for bringing out his Mondeo. And Ben, incidentally, I have become very friendly with. We got to know each other not just through the channel, but also more recently through spreading democracy throughout the galaxy via the medium of the rather wonderful and quite addictive video game Helldivers 2. And if you're currently sat there thinking, blimey James, I didn't know you played Helldivers 2, how do I find you on there? Send me an email and I will tell you how. Now, while we were walking around this car earlier, doing all my static shots and things, we were talking about it, and Ben said to me, he said, I wonder what sort of person would have spec'd this car from new, because who goes for a, let's be honest here, fairly plain looking silver car with black interior and yet specs the 2.5 litre turbo 5-cylinder engine, the least economical offering in the whole range. And unfortunately for this generation, they didn't do an ST variant. They had previously the much loved ST220, but for this generation, there was no longer a V6. This was the most powerful engine you could get. It also made, like its forebear, 220 horsepower, but didn't have the ST badging, nor, as far as I'm really aware, anything particular in terms of suspension, brakes to mark it out from, well, just about any other Mondeo of its day. And I thought, you know, I've actually encountered a few cars like this, because this was built, potentially anyway, registered certainly, in 2008. And that is when the world was in the midst of the financial crisis. It was also a time of great change for the company car market, because it was in the mid-2000s where people went from wanting the nicest, biggest, fanciest, most luxuriously appointed car they could get from the firm, and instead started wanting a more economical one. And this is all because in Britain in that time, the rules around company car taxation had changed. So where before people wanted the nicest thing the company was willing to pay for, now, because they would have to pay a little bit more on account of having the car, something called benefit in kind. In other words, the government looked at the car you had and went, that's effectively a form of pay, isn't it? So we're going to tax that. And as soon as that happened, people went, you know what, actually, I'll have the 1.8 litre Z-Tech. I'll be perfectly happy with that. It's fine. I'd rather have some more money. And so there were quite a few cars like this, and say a BMW 545 or 550 that the dealer had spec'd for a company car market that no longer existed. And then, of course, by 2008, well, a lot of people were out of a job, and cars like this weren't all that desirable. So I wager the first owner of this probably got quite the deal on it. And you know something? This is a car that I just never really ever think about. And I should, because you know something? It's brilliant. First off, really well sized. You can get 4 adults in here with room to spare. Enough, in fact, for another adult should you really want to, although by that point you'll be getting a little bit familiar with each other. It's also got an enormous boot. That in part is thanks to the front-wheel drive layout that the Ford had, as opposed to the rear-wheel drive layout of, say, a Mercedes or a BMW. And as it happens, it was the arrival of ever cheaper finance deals for the likes of BMW and Mercedes that really did put another nail in the coffin for cars like this. I mean, let's face it, 10 years earlier, in the sort of late 90s, you said to anybody that you drove a BMW or a Mercedes, and that was quite the statement. But by the late 2000s, it was nowhere near as unusual. Those cars became more commonplace, the finance deals got more aggressive, and customer demand and tastes changed. People no longer wanted to be seen in Fords, even if actually for the money, they were much better specified cars. And not only that, this is a really, really nice car to drive. Now, I'm sure it won't surprise you to hear that this car was bought at the suggestion of Paul's son, Ben. However, what might surprise you to hear is what it replaced. A Fiesta 1.25 litre, which Paul had had for a good number of years and very much liked, being almost a career Ford man. However, he found himself needing a little bit more space and comfort, and the Mondeo made a lot of sense. It has plenty of space. It is very comfortable. It's also, when you want it to be, quite good fun to drive. This 6-speed manual gearbox has a nice short throw, the clutch is fairly light, the engine wonderfully responsive. 220 horsepower, about 220 to 230 pounds-feet of torque. Finding exact figures was actually quite difficult. And you know what? It does move. My only real gripe about it actually is that when you do put your foot down and you get to the upper reaches of the rev range, the noise of that 5-cylinder is overtaken by the sound of air escaping through some of the holes in the rear, so it just sounds a bit like but that is a minor gripe. Steering is actually really nice. I've said for a long time now, there are 2 things that modern day Ford gets right nearly every time. That's seats and steering. And it's very true here. It's not the sharpest rack ever, but that I wouldn't really expect it to be. The comfort is really quite sensational, yet the body control is still very much there. There's a little moment of inertia as you go to turn in, but the weighting of the steering is nice, plenty of texture too. This has an electro-hydraulic rack, so it's still hydraulic, but electrically pumped, as opposed to being driven directly from the engine. Brakes, nice, responsive, quite light as you would expect in a car like this, but they do the job. Of course, discs all round. You can even rev match quite nicely. It is only when you really start to chuck it round a bend that the steering does let the side down a little bit, because it sort of refuses to weight up. However, this not being an ST badged product, I suppose that is something that I can find some forgiveness for. And I'm actually quite impressed to see that the trip computer says this car has been averaging 31.62 the gallon, which is really not bad for a reasonably large car with an old school 2.5 litre turbo 5 in it. And as you may have already gathered, this car is almost entirely standard. The only thing that has been altered is the exhaust, because having bought himself a lovely 2.5 litre turbo 5 cylinder, Paul was understandably a little bit disappointed that he couldn't hear it, and so the back boxes have, well, they've been cut off. And the result actually isn't quite as dramatic as you might think, because there is still a lot of silencing in the exhaust. The emissions, of course, also haven't been affected at all, but instead you've now got just a little bit of that nice throaty 5-cylinder sound accompanying you at all times. It's not too much, you could still happily do big miles in the car, and it's also exceptionally well presented, both outside and in. This is in fantastic condition. Now, 21-year-old me would never ever have given a car like this even a second glance, for one simple reason. It's front-wheel drive, and 21-year-old me was convinced that anything which didn't drive the rear wheels was, well, the work of the devil. My first car was a Peugeot 407, and as soon as I possibly could, I got rid of that and changed into a BMW 3 Series, never really to look back. However, now 34-year-old James realises that actually I was missing out on a lot of potentially very, very good cars. As it happens, when I was a younger man, I couldn't have afforded one of these because it would have still been a new car. They were introduced in 2007, facelifted in 2010, and then more or less discontinued in 2014. The 4th generation then took over, itself being discontinued a few years ago, and in China there is a 5th generation Mondeo, but as far as most of the world is concerned, the Mondeo nameplate is now no more. And that's a shame, because at its core, it's actually a really, really good car. It isn't the most exciting drive in the world, but it is, I would wager, a much better one than you might expect. And that engine definitely adds a dose of excitement where really, I think otherwise if you had, say, a regular 4-cylinder diesel, you might just go, it's alright, it gets me about. That engine puts a smile on your face all on its own. And I do really think it's quite the shame that Ford didn't choose to make an ST variant of this. They really could have done and should have done. I think the platform would have adapted to it really, really well. It's got ride comfort to spare. You could have easily lowered it a little bit, stiffened it, given it a little bit of a body kit. You've already got the 5-cylinder turbo engine in here. You know you can turn the dial up on that. You could have taken the engine from the RS and made something really quite spicy. But I guess someone somewhere said, yeah, we can make it, but it's going to cost lots of money, and not enough people are going to buy it. And I think they made a mistake, because I think they neglected to appreciate just how much that halo effect can be important to a brand. Having a Mondeo ST can sell Fiesta EcoBoosts. But the good news is that today, if you can find one of these, and they are a real rarity, with only 2 currently for sale on Auto Trader, you're not going to pay all that much money for one. You can pick one up, in fact, for about £2,000. And for that sum, it's a bargain. So, there we have it. I want to say a big thank you to both Paul and Bem for bringing their cars out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.